What happens when technology starts to read your mind, or even predicts your thoughts before you have them? In this episode, we dive into the rapid evolving frontier of brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs. A technology once confined to science fiction that's now redefining what it means to be human. From restoring mobility and conversations for those with paralysis, to potential merging of biological and digital selves, BCIs promise a future filled with groundbreaking innovation and also profound ethical challenges. Joining me today is Florian Solzbacher, co-founder and chief science officer of BlackRock Neurotech, one of the world's leading companies in neural interface technology. We'll explore everything from invasive versus non-invasive BCIs, privacy and mind data, policy gaps, and the risk of unconscious influence, including China's growing leadership in the field and past and future funding from government agencies like DARPA. We stand at the edge of a new era, one that could bring telepathic communication, control of our emotions and feelings, or even mind control devices into everyday life. We have to ask, who owns our thoughts? How do we regulate technologies that can alter human autonomy? And how do we ensure BCI remains a tool for empowerment and not control? This conversation isn't just about the future of neurotechnology. It's about the future of free will, privacy, and what it means to be human in an age where our minds could be the next digital frontier. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Florian, thank you for joining me on Rebelliously Curious. So we initially first met in New York City at the Mount Sinai BCI Brain Computer Interface Symposium. It was the second year. And to be honest, I feel that your energy for BCI and just general in technology is a little contagious. You have such a great spirit, and it's such a pleasure to have you on the podcast talking a little bit about the future of brain computer interfaces.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering whether I should blush now or whatever. Anyways, very, very kind of you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad that there's an opportunity there to hopefully help inform the general public and help answer questions that people may have and provide information background that will hopefully be valuable, because it's an exciting space that I think has a lot of potential to change people's lives to the better in many, many ways. People that for as long as mankind exists needed help in certain areas that we could never give, but that obviously can go beyond that as well. And so I consider myself very fortunate and lucky to be in the situation to be part of this journey.
It's so wonderful. And it's not the beginning of BCI, because BCIs really started in the 1960s. And about 30 years ago, we look at Tom Oxley, who is the founder of Synchron, who was funded by DARPA, that, really kind of initiated and sparked BCIs. And that's what really sparked my curiosity when I was younger. So for people that don't know, you are the co-founder of BlackRock Neurotech. Can you talk a little bit about what BlackRock Neurotech does within the BCI community? Because there are a whole bunch of companies that people might not be aware of, but people do focus and companies do focus on specific things when it comes to BCI. It could be invasive, non-invasive. It could be for it maybe helping to cure ALS, or be able to look at curing maybe Alzheimer's in some form or fashion. Along with blindness. So could we talk a little bit about what BlackRock Neurotech does?
Yeah, I gladly will. And its history is, of course, very much intertwined with a lot of the academic community that has been looking into these areas for several decades now. And then my own past and history, which I've shared with you a little bit when I was in New York, that for me, this journey started when I was a teenager and working as part of my sort of social and welfare activities at boarding school in the UK, and working with children with disabilities. And it frustrated me in the very early 90s, beginning of the 90s, that even at that time we didn't have any really advanced tools, despite the fact that electronics, computers, software, overall technology, even in the medical field, had advanced quite a bit. But we're not doing anything there. And that coincided, as you rightfully pointed out, with more and more people starting to think about brain-computer interfaces and solutions to interface the brain, parts of the nervous system, with technologies that would help restore function that had been lost, possibly even go beyond that. And ended up selecting my own studies along these topics. I was considering medicine, as I shared with you, and then realized that I'm more of an engineer and fiddler with technology than somebody who sort of learns things by heart. And then ended up focusing on electrical engineering, material science on the one hand, and biomedical engineering on the other hand, which put me on a track to start developing these solutions. BlackRock Microsystems was then many years later created after I'd sold my first company and started as a faculty at the University of Utah, and had reached a point where we had advanced technologies to the point where the question was, how do you bring this out there? Because I'm not a fundamental scientist. I'm an engineer. It's all about impact in the world and helping people. And so you need to transition from having contributed to the well of knowledge of how you could do something to actually putting things out there. And that led to me reconnecting with Marcus Gerhardt, my co-founder of BlackRock, who went to the same boarding school as me, and then thinking about how do we do this. As you may recall, there was a company at that time called Cyberkinetics Neurotechnologies, which was a Boston-based company that John Donahue, another colleague of mine, had created, which had in, I believe, 2002 or so, acquired the Utah electrode array technology, which, again, a senior mentor of mine and friend, Dr. Richard Norman, had originally invented. When I came to the University of Utah at the beginning of 2004, I reconnected with Dick Norman and we started working on advancing these technologies much further. 2007, we'd reached a point where essentially we're looking at the translation. I met with Marcus. I also reached out to Cyberkinetics, whether they would want to take the advances that we'd made and turn them into a product. At that time, the financial markets were wobbling for the first time before they collapsed. Long story short, it led to Marcus and me creating BlackRock Neurotech, acquiring a lot of those assets, merging them with a new technology. And then we did something, because this was pre-Elon Musk and Neuralink, and before Synchron really was that visible and, I think fully committed to being a BCI company. We decided to support the academic research market. And the idea was, if we give them electrodes, electronics, software, surgical tools, if we do this in a way that we've taken into account some of the regulatory and FDA requirements so that you can use it from tissue slices through animal models into human subjects, we could be a little bit like an Intel Inside. We provide the tools, and our friends and collaborators go into ALS and depression and tetraplegia and develop the use cases and the data algorithms and all of that. And we would learn together, mature the technology so that they would go from, this is a crazy idea, to something that people actually can use. And then, to get to a point where maybe financial markets would recognize us. And that is something where, again, as I shared in New York with you, Elon Musk with Neuralink and the co-founders of Neuralink did a lot of service to the community, because they started putting it on the map in the financial and commercial world. It's not that Medtronic and others hadn't looked at it, but it was just seen as something that is very far out there, not really seen as a potentially big market, technologically super challenging, and no reason to move. He kicked down that barn door with that, and he made it possible for the entire growing number of companies, and Precision Neuro, Paradromics, Synchron, BlackRock, Neuralink are just some of the ones that are sort of most visible in the implantable space, an entire host of non-implantable companies. Facebook or Meta for a little while was looking into implantable, then went non-implantable. All of this gained momentum, in the 2014, 15, 16 timeframe, when these companies when significant capital entered the market. Yeah. So if you think about how that's developed, and now we're sort of at a sort of a hockey stick curve where so many things that 30, 40 years ago were a dream. I think 20 years ago you could see the beginnings of this just might work, but it was highly experimental, highly criticized, a lot of risk, to something where today Synchron is ramping up patients, Neuralink is ramping up patients. We're over 50 patients now, some of them over 10 years. And I think the question of could it work and could it be done safely? Safety is always paramount, but I think we're now getting to a point where it actually becomes credible that one can feasibly offer a safe product that gives a lot of valuable function. And that is a fundamental difference to where we were before, which is, I think, very, very encouraging to see, because you go through these curves where you're super excited as a teenager and you want to change the world. And then you work at it for a few decades and you realize you're getting old and it's taking forever and it's not so easy. And to see that this is happening, I think is so encouraging. And in particular for the people we've wanted to help, to see it, we're going to make it there. That wasn't quite a 30-second pitch, but sort of.
No, it's so great. Yeah. It's so great because you are going to make it there, and we're seeing it. I'm writing about it. I'm following all the different companies. I've spoken to people that have had BCIs and people that have had them taken out of them. We've talked to people that are looking at, starting coalitions to be able to then create policy around BCIs. Like there's so much that's happening and it's in this community. And when you kind of step into it, you are shocked. And for me, it was the first time I went to the symposium. So I had so many different emotions when I was there because I was talking to people that were affected by ALS and Parkinson's and had been able to, or quadriplegics and had been able to have BCIs. And when one was removed from them, and from just that small moment of it being removed, my heart just dropped for them because I was like, oh no. And for them, they had that one moment where they were able to say, I know what that type of freedom felt like again. And it just, it broke my heart in so many ways. And you want to be able to champion BCIs for people that need them, because there's so many people in this space that you can see it would help it. Right now, millions, potentially billions around the world that need BCIs in so many different ways that can have contribute back to society, but have they feel that they have their life is meaningful as it is, but they can feel that they have more of a meaningful life in the way that they want to contribute back to the world. So I think what everyone is doing in the BCI space is really wonderful.
Yeah, no, I think we owe this to the people who need it to move this forward. I think it's wonderful that there are different technological solutions because, there's different needs out there, different risk-benefit profiles, things that people are looking for and priorities. And I think there are enough people out there that need this, that there's enough space for everybody who's in that race right now to be successful. Safety is really important, as I mentioned. And that is something that, I think we want to really keep on the radar screen, to be very thoughtful and cautious as we release these technologies. And then to scale up step by step. We want to make sure that any decisions that are made, you'd mentioned, a policy as well. I do think this is the right time to start the discussion about that, because it is becoming clear that the capabilities of these solutions can go beyond restoring function. And I think we have a moral and ethical responsibility as a community to take the lead and ownership of leading these discussions and making sure that policy and regulation is put in place, however, based on good information and knowledge, not based on perception. And so whenever we see stories about what people can do with this is very, very encouraging. And then sometimes you read the comments of people that hear about that, and some of it seems to be sometimes be driven by understandable fears, but that are, however, informed more out of science fiction literature or Hollywood movies or whatever. And I think it is important to understand that there's a lot that we can do in terms of restoring function, communication, even getting to higher order functions like intent, which means you no longer have to think about, I want to send an email, let's move my arm to click on an icon here. No, I would like to, send you an email with the following content, and get to that information, maybe with an AI agent, pre-formulate that email, see it quickly, and in the matter of a second or two, I've taken care of that, while taking care of some homework or some other things that I was doing. That's very intriguing. But can we read your dreams and your thoughts? No, we no, we're very far away from that. And I think this is where people are very concerned, about the safety of putting something into my brain. And then the second part is, the security and safety of the data. Are you getting to my inner self? Am I suddenly not able to hide my inner thoughts anymore and keep them private? I think we're very, very far away from that. Anyway, so that is one of the big concerns that I have as we go out there. I want to make sure that we don't get into a situation where, either somebody rushes things too much and people get harmed, or where general public fears lead to an overregulation that kills the innovation and then ultimately harms those people, some of whom don't have much time. If you're in ALS, these are often very rapidly progressing diseases. It irks me that we don't have easier and faster ways, even humanitarian device exemptions and everything. This is still a very slow and arduous process. I would love for them, if there was a way for me to make some of those technologies like the Utah array available today for some select groups. I would love to find a path towards that, given what we have in place.
Yeah, accessibility is a real big conversation as BCI start to grow. Who's going to fund the accessibility for people that can't afford a BCI? Will people be in line that can afford it before people that maybe do need it? And there is a time frame, let's say, maybe in life, and quality of life. And how do we assess that? And it's challenging because you see that the people that do need it should be getting this first, right? And healthcare should not be a backdoor to any advanced technology. And a lot of the times it is. But right now it's about how do we, in Canada, I'm from Toronto, and we are a capitalist socialist democracy, right? Like that is how we work as a socialist democracy. So we have capitalistic aspects of us, but we are a social democracy, and the States is a capitalistic democracy. So for us, if, I needed a BCI, I would be able to have one funded under OHIP more than likely. It would take a little bit of a time process to get there, but I would be able to get one at one point in time. In the States, that operates very differently. And so how how do we get around this? What is the best options for people that need it? And how do we implement it so that there's affordability, but also we don't run into a space where we have to upgrade the tech if it's invasive, every 5 to 10 years. And having brain surgery is, it might be fast. I know with the Neuralink, it's 10 minutes, they're saying. When they did the first implant, it was an hour, but they can do it in 10 minutes. Sure, it might be quick, but it's still brain surgery.
Right. And the total procedure is still long. So it's 10 minutes is the actual insertion of the device.
Fair enough. Yeah.
There's still procedure that comes around it. But no, they've made major progress there. I'm so glad you're mentioning it. There are several aspects in that. Let me comment on the accessibility first. I think ultimately, of course, business models and the society and reimbursement in a specific country do play a major role. But what we as manufacturers and as engineers building these devices can do is, and that's something that we've been trying to do on the BlackRock side very much, is from the get-go to try and use technologies and approaches that inherently allow you to scale and make devices at a much, much lower cost than traditional medical devices. A lot of the medical device technologies, and in particular when it comes to implants, go back to work, that started with Earl Bakken and others, who used a shoebox to hide electronics in it. A lot of it is, custom, titanium or ceramic cans with feed-throughs and some electronics. A lot of it is similar to aerospace technology, actually quite old for two reasons. One of them is safety. And after decades of establishing a safety track record, you really don't like to play much with it. But there are a lot of technological advances that have since happened that we're not leveraging in that industry. And that leads to sometimes cost structures, for pacemakers and these type of things. Often medical device makers go into third world countries or second world countries to try and more cheaply make those. And even so, they're still very far away from the capabilities that you'd find in your smartphone. And so that's one thing we can do is from the get-go, instead of designing something that costs thousands or tens of thousands of dollars to make, and then subsequently requires 10,000, tens of thousands, or $100,000 to sell just for the business model to work, to do something that hopefully maybe only costs a few tens of dollars or $100 or $200 or $400 for all I care, and then allows you to position that so that it's far more accessible. And that includes, of course, there's still ranges in society, and a lot of the people that, like, for example, are in a situation where they have severe tetraplegia do rely on government-funded healthcare support for these type of things. But I think it's not impossible to have something be offered that's in the range or possibly even cheaper than the wheelchair van that you may need to get around, So sort of getting into a range where people may be able to self-pay because it's enabling, or where maybe an employer may pay for it to allow you to get back into a job or so. Or where the price could really be so that it's not so far away from, at least for the device, for a computer or a smartphone or something. The challenge is, of course, the procedure, the clinical procedure, and that is something where Neuralink has made major steps. The more you can move that towards something that is more like a LASIK clinic or so, or the quicker and shorter it is, the cheaper it probably can be. But this is one of the things that is sort of really, really important on the accessibility side. I'm actually convinced that we're at an inflection point now where these technologies do not have to be something that, like in our first DARPA project, where the arm alone cost $500,000 to make. You would have to sell this for $3 million for this to make sense. That was the arm alone without the interface, and to bring this into a realm where a big portion of people, at least I would say in the developed world, United States, Canada, Europe, etc., either would see their healthcare systems gladly paying for it, or where it would be in a range where it may be a bit of a lift, but something that if it lasts long enough, you will gladly pay for. Which now brings me to the second part is our aspiration, my aspiration has always been to make sure that we build technologies that become invisible. And it has two sides. One of them has to be that, as you said, even though the neurosurgeons that you talk to, but brain surgery is a major invasive surgery, just to be clear. However, compared to when you talk to neurosurgeons who regularly do epilepsy, Parkinson's, brain cancer, etc., when they compare those procedures to what they're doing with placing a small electrode on the brain, or even something like Neuralink that is injected a few millimeters into the brain, they're privately often quoted with saying, I'm not sure why you're getting so excited about this. Compared to what I do day in and day out, this isn't so dangerous. But I very much understand in the general public the perception saying, oh my God, somebody opened the skull. It's actually not the bone opening that's the problem. It's once you open the dura and then you fiddle in the brain tissue, if you cause infections there, that is super dangerous and you have to be very, very careful. So first of all, you want to make sure that whatever you build is as invisible as possible to the immune system. Secondly, you want to make sure that these devices, ideally for the implant portion, can last, my dream is a lifetime, 30, 40, 50 years. This is kind of what we're targeting right now, so that you can really put it in and you forget it's there. It's just there because of what it enables you to do. And so these are materials and engineering challenges, of course, and biocompatibility challenges you're addressing. But I think there's massive progress that has been made, which I think, even with the Utah array, which is the grandfather of all those technologies in human subjects, and which is often described as very invasive and having massive glial response and whatever. In practice, people have been using these things for 10 years reliably and safely in human subjects, and there's over 50 now people who've had these devices. So that is possible with the next generation's devices. I think it is quite feasible to significantly exceed it. On the benchtop, we're already there, but ultimately it'll really only be the test if people have had these implants for 20 years, for 30 years. There's some examples. Some people have had cochlear implants for 30 years now. And so it is very, very difficult, but it's possible. And I think with the right people and the right level of funding, we will get there. And then you have a solution, as I said, that should be so that if you choose to have a device removed or you want an upgrade, you can, but you don't have to. We try to build what we build currently as a third generation device is supposed to be future-proof for quite a while with computing built in and other capabilities, so that the rest can largely happen on the software side, on the outside. And that is going to become one of these important decision points. At what point are we allowed to transition to something that's like you're on my laptop, where every few years you throw it away, every 3 months you update your software, which again, for medical implants, that is very constrained. That's why that never changes. So let's keep the part that is inside the body, and it has to be super safe. Let's keep that regulated and with only marginal changes and updates only after extensive testing, etc. But whatever's on the outside, I very much hope that through the efforts that we're all working on jointly as an industry community, through the IBCI, the Implantable BCI collaborative community with the FDA, that we get to a point where there's an acknowledgement that whatever happens with the data on the outside is a lot more like your app on your phone or whatever, that then allows you to make progress with the speed of software and capabilities on that front. And I hope that one should get you the best of both worlds, which is a device that, you don't do brain surgery every 2 or 3 or 4 years, maybe every 10 or just once.
You would only really need one BCI as of now, right? When we look at the technology, and I can see it makes more sense to have a computer to be able to update it, programming, all of that. It makes total sense. And being able to have the device maybe over time be smaller, right? And maybe, but it's still fairly small now. I believe like Neuralink's the size of a quarter, I believe. It's very small.
Yeah, I mean, they have the biggest part in their case is a battery. They've decided on an approach where they're using an implantable battery that essentially they're replacing part of the skull's bone with that. Very, very clever solution, actually. And then they have these thin electrode threads that are threaded into the tissue. And the uterate were needles. In the case of precision paradromics, it's also a set of needles where they can. The neural lace comes as a surface grid, optionally with some needles or not, but super, super thin. With the focus to make sure that to the human body becomes invisible. So it's again, safety first, longevity, invisibility, equity, so that it's affordable and accessible. I think if we do this right, this can become really broadly used and help a lot of people.
It will help people all around the world. And we're seeing all different types of countries develop their own BCIs all the way from Germany. We look at Spain. We're looking at, Canada working with American companies right now. But we're also seeing China make really bold statements about wanting to be, the first at this. They do this, let's be honest, a lot of countries do this. It's political, right? It's a form of, I would say, saber rattling in a weird way, even though it's not war, it's more on a tech side, saying that they are way more advanced and potentially are way more advanced. They want to be the head in quantum computing. So we're seeing that China is saying, we want to be the top, be one of the top members within the BCI community and lead this. And that's a very bold statement. Now, the fear that China becomes, the best at BCIs. And from what I have heard recently from someone that was telling me, I'm unfortunately not able to say the company, but they were telling me that when they were in China recently in the healthcare sector, they were in BCI rooms. People had brain computer interfaces, and it was literally like Minority Report. They had BCI rooms where they were using computers with their minds, and they're way more advanced than what we are. So the fear that China will be ahead of us in North America when it comes to BCI is a very scary position, for the fact that we aren't there is no global policy, and there is no way that we can control China and what they're doing when it comes to this BCI advancement and what they do from a consumer aspect outside of healthcare. So what do we do in this position? We can have Americans and Canadians and people from Europe potentially, as this, becomes into the consumer mind and in the consumer market, that they'll be able to go to China and be able to get a BCI. Like BCI tourism at one point could be a real thing. Like, I know people might laugh at that, but it's true. We can't stop people from doing that. How do we find a relationship with China so that we create some form of global policy, so that when we move this into a consumer place, that we're not in a really dark space when it comes to humanity and what BCIs could mean for the future?
Yeah, I think, this is a broad topic. I think one thing that we clearly have under control, you can't forget, we were actually, not only were we the first ones, there's a lot of value in long-term experience. And BlackRock, Neurotech, ever since the first Utah experiments in human subjects in 2002 already, started gathering data, and that longitudinal data is super important. We're now, with BlackRock's Neuralink, leapfrogging into a third or fourth generation even of capabilities. I'm quite well aware of some of the efforts that have been happening in China. Not all of that is it's become more and more secretive over recent years. There's a decent amount of government support there. Most of what we're seeing there is comparably traditional, I would say, in its approaches. So these are things that are largely based on the kind of approaches we took 15, 20 years ago towards these things. They have state support, and scalability, of course, is an important aspect. But I do believe that in terms of technological capability, as well as safety, we not only have a responsibility, but the unique opportunity to continue to lead the world. And I believe all the US companies are, in principle, aligned in that. And I believe what we need to make sure of is that we continue to do so. So we have to keep innovating. We cannot stand still. We need to have, by a clear margin, the best possible products. And if we then can make sure, going back to my previous argument, that they're also accessible, so that equity component is there for people, I think that is probably one of the best safeguards against tourism to other countries. Ideally, we want to have the tourism come to us so that it's our standards for those devices and our platforms and our safety protocols that govern that, and that people will want to do this because they're safer, their life is better, and the capabilities vastly outperform. Now, I do agree that in areas like AI and machine learning, I would not underestimate China, and that is an important aspect in how some of these systems work. They were much sooner in investing in this strongly. I remember almost 2 decades ago that I saw developments there where, as an academic, I realized, oh my God, they're accelerating really hard. The US is fast asleep. Politics is asleep. Industry is asleep. They're not seeing where this is going. This has now largely changed, and I think we've seen massive advances. But as I said, I would not underestimate it. And I think we have a responsibility to make sure that we don't end up in a situation where we invent it, we lead it, and then when it becomes a worldwide product that people will use, it moves somewhere else. This is a national security thing from my point of view. Also something that goes deep into our culture, our way of life. And so that means that, it's like the famous quote, speak softly, but carry a big stick. You want to make sure you're unquestionably technologically number one, safety number one, in capabilities, and the place where people want to go to get these solutions. What beyond that can be done on, I think industry, at least in the Western world, tends to coalesce around industry organizations that help define standards, certain things that everybody else accountable for. There are things that we're all interested in, paths to reimbursement, regulatory standards, data standards, things that, are valuable so that everybody knows, that we don't have 100,000 different things that collide and don't work. That's in nobody's interest. We compete based on performance, specific use cases, but work towards that. Into other countries, in particular, if there's a political adversity situation as what we find ourselves in right now, with other powers competing for leadership status in the world, I don't know. As I said, the only thing that I think we can influence on our side is make sure that it's another version of the American dream, so to speak. You can make it here, but just like, even people from Europe that end up here, like myself, because this is the top tier, the Formula One in science and engineering. Doesn't mean that they're not great people elsewhere as well, but you're really attracted here because there are so many of the brightest minds, the best people, the coolest technologies, the courage to pioneer, which America has always had. And I'm sometimes a little bit afraid that we may lose some of that, this courage to innovate and dream big and say, you know what? Let's try this out. Let's make this work.
Morgan Stanley recently had a report that came out that was
Mhm.
doing this estimate of the situation, we'll say, of
Mhm.
Neuralink, and estimating it in Neuralink specifically around 400 billion. Now, previously, you did say, Neuralink and Elon Musk really brought so much attention to the investor space, and 100% will agree with that. But looking at Morgan Stanley's private report, there was a lot of red flags just waving in that report, saying, looking at commercialization, looking at the advancements of technology, the lack of policy right now, even though there have been conversations, and Mind Act through Chuck Schumer has been moved in Congress, but that just started on September 24th. It's just so new. It's at its infancy. So we see these red flags that I find Morgan Stanley was really kind of waving. When you looked at that report, if I believe that you might have seen this, or if you've heard that report, I know I did a piece on this. What was your thoughts when you first saw that? Is it for you? Did you see blaring red flags when it came to Neuralink? And I will say separately out of this, and this is 100% my opinion, but when I was at the BCI symposium, Neuralink was nowhere to be found, but everybody else was really representative. And every company was there looking at this from a healthcare perspective, but there was no way of Neuralink. We had surgeons and people that have worked with Neuralink in companies, but there was no representative, not that I ever met and ever saw, that was speaking on the bill. So then instantly this Morgan Stanley aspect comes out and really says that there's this backdoor to healthcare, in that, Neuralink is really looking at the consumer aspect of this for the future, and maybe not so much the healthcare aspect. Although there are apparently, over 10,000 people lined up for a BCI, but still a little scary when Morgan Stanley says that. And maybe this is a backdoor to healthcare from a Neuralink perspective.
Yeah, I don't know. I usually like to refrain from sort of commenting and on sort of what other companies are wanting or planning to do in terms of their business plan and direction. I also have no intricate knowledge of what they're really thinking and doing. What I shared with you, during our meeting in New York, is that for me personally, everything starts and ends with the patient, with the people who need it, their goals, their needs in life, enabling that. I'd also shared with you that where I do agree is that ultimately the technology has the potential to go beyond medical use cases. And we need to be aware of that. We can't close our eyes in front of that. So we need to deal with that. Hence my comment about policy. Let's work on this together. Ethics, let's create the ethics boards, discuss that, because I could imagine as a next step, first responders, firefighters, military personnel in dangerous situations who, may ask to have some of those technologies if they help them be safer, kept out of harm, etc., have other advantages. These are people that, compared to normal people like you and I, have a very different risk profile and maybe risk-benefit calculation in all of this. And ultimately, there could be a future where people may use that. Now, the Morgan Stanley report touches on a number of the major challenges in that there's, in reality, there's currently no clear path for such a product to out there. There's a few in the cosmetic surgery realm, some examples, so anecdotal, where people have looked into this one. But this is a space where there are a lot of open questions that I think all have to be addressed before something like this can be a reality. I would also say that for larger groups of people to have access for such technology, it's usually safer to slowly ramp up and learn, and that takes time. You can't fast track that. There's certain things that you can accelerate, when you crash test cars, or, even when you build rockets or launch vehicles, if you have enough money, instead of simulating for years and modeling, you can blow them up, learn from that. Really works. I mean, these are not new concepts. People have been doing this occasionally. Fail fast, learn what's wrong, move on. Do not ever do this with a brain implant.
I understand. And it's not so much to be horrible to Neuralink. I think what they're doing is wonderful. It's just seeing a red flag to me and backdoors of healthcare is a scary thing.
That
to
was
see.
your biggest. That was the biggest red flag for you, sort of the healthcare backdoor, or were there other aspects in that report?
I think there was multiple aspects in that report to me that was, a little bit more. Just, I was very wary, and trust me, I think that BCIs are amazing, but we know that BCI can go into a really, really horrible space if we let it, if we don't have policy. We saw that with social media. We had no policy when it came to social media, and look what's happened to us, unfortunately. And that was because we had corporate companies that have decided to knew that there was no policy and took advantage of that. And so now we have it, but it was too late. And so this is the same idea that, I think when it comes to BCIs, if, we have learned from our mistakes and policy conversations are happening, but I think that we need to have more of these conversations when we look at moving into the commercial space, and that is happening. Synchron has, from a healthcare perspective, did its first BCI and partnership with Apple. And so we're seeing that people were using iPads in connection with a consumer brand and product with the BCI. It's the first commercialization of it. And so commercialization is next on the table. And to me, that is very scary when you have very limited policy. We're seeing things like companies that are popping up right now, and you can find them online, about driving cars with your mind, which, don't get me wrong, I think is really cool at the same time. But how far is too far when it comes to commercialization?
Well, I think, as I said, if you go back to safety and knowing what you're doing, a lot of that is about, giving back freedom and function to people. So on the driving side, I'm actually very glad you're mentioning that, because the social media is one of those examples that I use to say, if you're not careful, you end up establishing business models that inherently lead to unintended consequences that can be dire. And so we need to build in those safeguards, both as engineers and hopefully the business models and policies. But, the reality is, if you talk to any of our, 50 previous subjects and ongoing subjects that have had implants, of course they want to interact with a computer. They want to control this because they're limited. So that is not the problem. It is, to some extent, making sure it's done safely. You need to also understand that, even if you do get to intent is not volition or getting into any deeper thoughts. You need to make sure that the personal data is protected. But that is not so unsimilar from your cell phone. We're so transparent. The US has such lax laws with respect to data security compared to Europe that technically most of what we want and do, if you have a smartphone and you shop online and you watch a movie at night, or you listen to music, or you read a book, somebody will have created a profile about you that is so good that it tends to recommend stuff to you unless you constantly empty the cache memory or whatever. I think that is something we need to work on, and we do. So we've been very actively involved in this from the get-go. What surprised me a little bit in the report, again, and that shows you again how so disconnected sometimes this part of the world, the financial world, and possibly even politics is, because it's more driven by sort of broader public perception from what happens on the ground floor, is there was no mentioning, for example, of the Utah array technology and BlackRock in that, which is strange because this is where it came from. The highest number of implant patients, the largest number of implant days, the largest numbers of clinics and university hospitals that use BCIs today in science to advance things, to help people with tetraplegia, with ALS, build speech. The records for fastest thought to text or thought to speech is still the Utah array. And it shows you, again, that's why I said Elon Musk opened that door, but it's still not entirely there. There's an entire tier of people that is disconnected from the community that we came out of, which was the academic community that dreamed these things up. And many of us united in that thought, let's understand the brain and let's help people get function back. And we've responsibly built this up to the stage where we are right now.
I agree, but at some point you're going to get more of the finance bros in this space. We're seeing the Bitcoin bros, join this. And so at some forum, that community, those communities are so much larger than the academic community as we start to move into globalization or consumer in the consumer aspect. So here's also the other thing. Who owns the data then? Who will get to own the data? Because right now it's tiny data, right? It's not enough to, sell to Netflix, let's say. But at some point in time, you're right. I have my cell phone, but and some of that data they already have instantly. But when it's in my mind, there are moments for sure. Maybe I'm not reading your thoughts, but I'm having a moment where my thoughts are being recorded. And we know that through silent communication that we're seeing through Alter Ego that is out of MIT labs. And we're seeing that they can track the silent communication and I can multitask and do all of these things. And I can do that with a non-implantable BCI now, currently to date. And so that I can literally think of something and have my phone write it down while I'm doing something else. So there is this multitasking. So it is recording my thoughts, my inner thoughts at that moment. So who gets to keep that data? Do I get it or do you get it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, so first of all, of course, of anything that's an implant, that is always a medical device, and in most cases a class 3. And these things are heavily regulated. The HIPAA, there's laws already in place that protect that data between the caretaker and the subject. What you often do find is in like the case of cardiac pacemakers, other implants, etc., that exist today, that the companies retain the right to use some of their data to improve their product. But usually there's a request for what is called de-identification. So there may be information about certain properties of the electrodes of the device, certain waveforms that represent something, for example, a certain hand gesture, a movement, a phoneme that's part of your speech, whatever, that can be used to make the algorithm better. But, it doesn't say this is, this was Florian's brainwave at that timestamp. That information does have to be de-identified. And so the data security aspect, these are some of the things that we're all thinking about. This is super important to those of us who are responsibly doing this. And it is also critical to build trust in that entire system, that this is there. So people understand that you're far more likely to have information stolen from the stuff you put on YouTube, Facebook, your other social media stuff, or just using your phone with the privacy settings not set right, than you are to lose, a data that may allow people to trace back what you have wanted at a specific point in time. But it is important. It does need to be regulated in a clear way. I do think it is important, if you want to, for example, traditionally these brain-computer interfaces required individual calibration. And when we started, 15, 20 years ago with this work, it would sometimes take weeks to get this thing to move the cursor in a meaningful way. Today, you switch it on, it immediately sort of works. You don't need to constantly recalibrate, but it's still quite individual. Ultimately, if this is scaled up, you want to make sure that you can just switch it on, just like a phone. And so there is the need to have enough data to make sure that the underlying algorithms make sure that your phoneme, my phoneme, my friend's phoneme are all are all so understood that I don't need to train my BCI. But that being said, your thought, your data, your decisions have to stay yours.
I agree, because as we start to move into the consumer aspect, if I'm watching, let's say, Netflix, or I'm watching TV and I have a BCI, and this is, in a commercial aspect where I decide to be able to have a BCI, and I should be able to own that data, because the Netflix knows exactly now what I'm watching. Let's be honest.
Right.
But if I was moving to all different types of streamers, it could see my movement and what I'm watching, where I'm going to, when I'm, all of that TV data, let's say I have, but it's way bigger than that.
You need consent, you need encryption, you need all these things need to be in there for this to work. And I think it's high time, as I said, to decide this, make it so that innovation is possible, that we can keep advancing, but there need to be some guardrails. And I think that will become an important aspect also of this leadership argument that I made, that ultimately, if other nations are competing for that, we can hopefully be the providers of choice, because safer, better in every aspect.
Yeah. My last question to you then is, I have to ask, when it comes to defense, just because we have DARPA funding BCI doesn't mean that they're using it for defense. It started 30 years ago. They fund many different things, but I have spoken to people that have worked into healthcare, and defense companies or contractors that are adjacent to, that have government contracts, have been asked to come and work for them. So it's scary. We know that for sure, we look at vets, huge area for BCIs, right? Active vets and non-active, vets and people that are still actively serving right now, right? So there's a massive space for them. But the American public won't really know what is going on with BCIs in defense. And that can be very scary, especially when defense is interested in this, and then adjacent to it is consumerization. There's a very blurry area when it comes into privacy, and as this technology starts to develop. And this is not in any form of conspiratorial, but we know that the BCI, especially Neuralink, we know that it does work on a subliminal level. When I interviewed Nolan, I asked him, how intuitive is the link? And he said, I couldn't believe how intuitive it was. He's like, sometimes even before I thought of something, it already moved. And so he didn't even have to think of it. It was working on that subliminal level where his thought, he was going to think about that, but it already ended up happening. So it was already kind of predictive. That's really scary. We know that is possible. So the question is, am I going to be able to have my own thought then? Or is the BCI going to be working and creating those thoughts? This is so far off.
I think and
its emotions are a big aspect of that too. I can create an emotion with the BCI. And we've seen that in the 1960s with a Spanish researcher. It was Dr. Jose de Long, shocked a lot of researchers, where he was stimulating a bull's emotions, and he could make the bull angry, but he could also stop that emotion. These are real things that we have to be mindful of, because if it gets into the wrong hands, this could entirely change society. And to me, that's what I felt Morgan Stanley was pointing at a little bit too.
Okay, so this is now an additional dimension, of course. So there's on the one hand the side of BCI that has potentially the capability to not only act as an interface for motor communication, etc., but of course, you can also restore sensation. Now there's the entire psychological and mood disorder area where it can possibly work wonders in, fighting depression, but you could potentially also enhance or accelerate certain negative aspects, anger, other things, emotions, etc., that could be felt. I think this is still very, very early to have conclusive thoughts about it, that in principle, these types of things are possible, is theoretically there. But I think we are orders of magnitude away from the capabilities that have been shown today in motor and in other function. Now, I'm trying to address this because there are multiple angles here. One of them is the DoD side, and DoD, DARPA has for many years in medical technology supplemental NIH, and it's become even more important now that NIH is seeing some funding constraints in advancing technologies. The majority of programs, by the way, in the past were for wounded warriors and restoration, by the way. That being said, of course, it's also become clear, with the Utah array, there was work done with drones, with flight simulators. I'd mentioned to you as the driving work that we have been doing, where it's become clear that, reflexes, for example, can maybe not surprisingly be much, much faster. And there is a significant upside. Just imagine somebody like our subjects driving their car because they want to be independent, they want to be in control through a neighborhood. And they're able, kid runs into the street 3/4 of a second faster than you or I can. The subject slams on the brake and stops the car. Even at walking speed, that makes a massive difference. So there's a safety aspect there, which now ties into your possibly underlying question of, are there areas where this may be interesting for defense applications? Now, this is for DoD to answer. I could see situations where in protecting military personnel that's in the field, as I said, this could be valuable and helpful, like body armor and other things. I'm not entirely sure how the offensive potential would be there, but that is, of course, very much a societal question to some extent. Again, goes back to what we as a country want to allow to happen. And unfortunately, in that context, knowing that we're not in a vacuum, because this is now a global situation. And so now I'm sort of falling back into something I said before, where I said, if these technologies exist, I'd rather make sure we as a nation have them and we lead in safety and in controls and whatever, than others who may not have some of those breaks built in. But I think as a society, we need to address that. And I think compared to what advanced AI and machine learning systems can do today that are far more locked in, I don't want to be quoted in sort of in downplaying that, because that's not what I'm trying to do here. But just like I said, in terms of transparency of who you are, your smartphone and computer use is orders of magnitude more precise and better at making you a glass person where everybody sees everything you desire and want and do and when and where you are, than a BCI, at least for the next few decades. And I think the same is true in terms of military and offensive potential. These computer systems, if it's about these split-second decisions, scenarios to simulate through, these advanced machine learning systems are just much, much faster than the biology that we're dealing with. So I see people being less and less in the loop there, except for on a high organizational level, the ability to run many, many things in parallel, maybe having AI agents interact with you. So that you integrate that one I could possibly see. But it's you're touching on I always like starting and ending on a high note here. This is something that as a society we need to address and decide how we want to deal with it, knowing full well that it will happen. I think that is, I've come at it always from, I want to help people. I've been spent my entire adult and late teenage life pursuing this. I think it's wonderful that we see it happening, but I want to make sure that we're careful with it, that we do it right, that it's safe, and and yeah, that's
I
hopefully
agree.
we're the nation that sets the standards. I mean, I'm really, as I said, I'm extremely grateful for all of that has happened. And the rest we just need to, with eyes wide open, go into is and make sure that we lead the world in terms of the
I
ethics and the
agree.
safety.
And this is why we have these conversations. It's not to say that, people, all these different companies are intending to do this. That's not the case. A lot of people like yourself and so many other people that are working in healthcare want to provide wonderful options for people to have more of a meaningful life the way that they want to live their life. And the reason why I ask the questions around emotions and defense is because they are serious questions that we all need to start having. And this might not be the general public. I know it's such a
Mhm.
small group and there's not even that many journalists that cover BCI, but that will change. It will change
Mhm.
fast. So I've spoken to companies all over North America and within Europe, and I have been told specifically, and you're right, like North America hopefully will stay the leader in this, and it still stays in a healthcare position, but when it moves into commercialization, that we know what we're doing and policies put in place. Because I have heard that China is extremely interested, and this is coming from different companies that have spoken
Mhm.
to me, on background, and have said that China is really interested in the emotional aspect of BCIs and
Yes.
contribute to longevity there. And we can get into so many different conversations around that,
This
but
is for the next 10 hours of the interview, right?
exactly. But it's true. There are so many
Mm.
different countries that will have different applications for BCIs. And we need to be
Mhm.
very mindful of that because, for sure, healthcare right now is the primary focus and should stay the primary focus consistently for BCI. And there should be a slow global development of brain computer interfaces when it comes to commercialization because we need to have conversations and we can't have it in the hands of the wrong people. And unfortunately, that will happen. There will be bad actors, but we need to be able to, that specific countries and specific leaders are doing this for the intent and well being of others and not control and persuasion and selling data.
Yeah, and I mean, as I said, continuing to attract the right talent, making sure we lock down certain technologies and advancing, I think, is a really, really important aspect in making sure that we can retain that control over that field. So I'm actually quite hopeful that we have it in us as a nation and society to do the right thing and enable that, have the pioneering courage that the people had who entered this continent um, you know 250
I
years plus ago, to sort of trailblaze and uh, you know create new technologies and usually approach things with a why not? Let's figure out how to do this. I think we want to do this, but do it right with the right standards, and then I think there's very little else that you can do beyond that, really, to be perfectly honest.
I don't know if I want to be CI yet, so I hope that it takes a long time. Florian, thanks so
Yes.
much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious. I know there were some questions for sure that we don't know yet. We have to wait and see what time will tell about BCIs and what happens. But I appreciate you being open and having a discussion with me today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I'm very grateful that you've taken the time and to give us a platform to communicate these topics. I think it's very important to engage society at large with that, to inform them, to make them aware of both the opportunities, the risks, understand them. I think the commitment to do this well, and if I may, I'd like to use this also to say a big thank you to everybody out there. Starting with the people who had the courage to do this. You said, you're not ready yet for that. Just imagine, 15, 20 years ago, the first people they sometimes had to fight their families to get it. They said, you're crazy. Everything's broken except for your head. Now you're getting a brain implant, to have the courage to do this for the better good of mankind and science, to say, they had no expectation this would actually help them. Of course, it's given him some meaning of life in contributing. And, the successful generations, all the collaborators, the people that believed in that, this country as well, the US government, be it through NIH, DARPA, DOE, and other mechanisms to support this when it was highly experimental. When I still remember friends and colleagues in Europe who said, "You are crazy. Why are you putting implants into the brain? This will never work." And I said, well, people here think we can do this. And we showed everybody we can. The advances of the Utah array technology, then seeing the other players start. And as I said, a lot of academic collaborators who've believed in us. And now the fact that, financial markets are seeing an opportunity, are believing in this as well. And just like the Human Genome Project, we're now at that inflection point. And so thank you to lots of people. We have a wonderful team on the company side that I'm very grateful for, that some of us have stuck with me through almost the decades now. Some have joined more recently to move this forward. And to be part of this and live to see these moments where it's not just a few dozen people who you will have interacted with, who will have fire in their eyes and are grateful for what it gives them, but to make sure that anybody out there who says, "I would like to have one because I need it," and then you can have one, and you can have one safely and without worrying that, your data is stolen or anything else untoward happens. So it's
going to be an interesting time. And I agree. If for healthcare, if you need it, please, we should be giving people BCIs now. But we'll see when the future comes. And this is why we have these conversations, so that we go in the right direction. And if anything, I will see you all when we get to the singularity. And then we can have another conversation when that happens about where we're at in time. And when everything comes to a head, and I do hope I am alive to see that. I know that they've said that the singularity might be like 2035. I know Sam Altman has said that with the merge, but from what I've heard from a lot of other people, it's not very close. It's very far away. So I hope that at least I get to see it. So, maybe we'll have another conversation again when the singularity happens.
I hope so too. As I'm at heart, I'm an optimist, and I do believe that even though there are some aspects where this species, you sometimes have doubts, but I think we'll so far we've mastered every challenge that came our way, and so I'm hopeful that we'll address that as well if and when we get there. But for right now, as I said, thank you so much again for the time and engaging with these topics. And let's keep the communication channels open. I'm always curious to hear, what people are thinking. And then as we start developing the policies, the regulations for these things, we'll be walking this path together.
I think so. Thank you.